Welcome to Off the Shelf Conversations with Authors. I'm Martha Kofod. Our guest today is Bill Lederer. Bill, thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
I understand you're a playwright,
Yes.
and we're very interested in your background, how you got started as a playwright. Would you care to tell us?
Yes, I distinctly remember I was a med student at the time, and in my first year of med school, and I was listening to the radio, and the play of Samuel Beckett's came on, called Waiting for Godot, which is a classic. And I thought, my goodness, how I wish I could do something like that. So I started to tinker around myself with dialogue, and I was off and running. Then I submitted a prose poem that was about 70 pages to a well-known poet. I also wrote poetry. And he said, why don't you make this into a poetic drama? So I took the script, made it into a poetic drama, and got together a lot of actors from Hull House, and they went with it, and we got a production on it, and that was back in 1964.
So these actors at Hull House, were they volunteers, or was this an established company?
Yes, they were all well-known actors at the time. It was a place that all the avant-garde theater was being done at that time in Chicago. So it was, some actors were equity, some were very good amateur actors.
How large is that theater? How large is that audience?
The Hull House Theater
Hull
was
House.
about 300 at the time.
Oh, that's good size.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, when you write a play, do you submit it for copywriting to protect? How do you do that?
Well, as soon as I finish writing a play, I send a copy to to Washington, D.C. and get it copyrighted. Mm-hmm. So that's an automatic thing that I do. And then I send it around to my friends, fellow actors and playwrights who have worked with me in the past, and directors, producers, and they know my work, so it's...
Do you ever produce and direct your own plays?
I've only directed one of my plays. I have a weakness. I can get actors and actresses to what they call the subtext fast, because I know what I meant in my writing. But I'm not good at rounding things out and getting it very precise. So usually, I'm glad to have a director around. So,
right. When you
but
start
I have
writing,
done it once or twice.
Okay. When you start writing a play, do you have a plot in mind, or do you have dialogue that?
Well, it varies all over the place, but I'm a little bit unusual in that department. Most playwrights get an inspiration from a potential scene or an actor's dialogue, something like that. I usually think of the art form and what I want to, sort of a Weltanschauung, a general impression that I want to carry over in the play, and then I set a couple actors in the scene, and it takes off from there.
And do you establish the scene when you write the play, or do you just do the dialogue, or do you have something in mind for a setting?
I'm a little different there, too, than many of my fellow playwrights and directors that don't know me get a little bit irritated, because I write a lot of stage directions, because my plays require specific use of gestures, and my gestures sometimes work with the language and sometimes against the language. And for instance, you can have somebody put his arms out like this, and you don't know whether he means embrace me or leave me alone, I want to be free. Mm-hmm. So I've got to write that into the as stage directions, because I want my director to make sure to deliver the gesture right.
Okay. Now, how would you categorize your plays, or are they all over the place? Do you do comedy? Do you do very serious, dramatic?
I've done everything. tragic comedies, comic tragedies, straight comedies, historical dramas, the whole works. You know, I've written over 100 plays, the whole works. But the way I've been categorized by the critics, I'm a absurdist playwright. I come out of the absurdist tradition of Albee, Beckett, Ionesco, Harold Pinter, and also some of the famous directors like Grotowski from Poland, and another director, Artaud. So I'm considered a surrealist, absurdist playwright, but I've written straight naturalistic plays too.
Well, you mentioned your background as a med student and, of course, pre-med. You must have also studied extensively or read a lot of these plays to have the background to emulate them.
Yes, I loved plays. I loved reading them. And I realized an interesting thing is, I heard Beckett's play over the radio, and I thought, this is beautiful. It's just simple poetry, like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you know. Mm-hmm. But underneath it all, it had implosion, so much texture. And then I looked at the text, and I thought, why did I overrate this work? And then I realized that poetry for the theater, for the stage, is different than poetry on the printed page.
Is that because of the timing of the delivery?
I think it's more than that. It's the presence of a body. I can give you a hard example of that. I wrote, as I mentioned before, this poetic drama. Or first of all, it was a dramatic poem. But there was a line, there were three poetry lines, which in themselves, I think, are poetic. And they went like this. Her peach fuzz was, no, wait, excuse me. Yes, her peach fuzz was like slippery dust. My black swan withers in the brush. Cowl, pretty bird. Then when I'm in you, the glaze off your shoulder will ivory. Now that's abstract as the devil, you know. Where does that come from? But if I had a body there in theater,
delivering the lines,
visualize this. It's a body, she's strapped to a post, and somebody's about to torture her, and she goes, and the torturer says, her peach fuzz is like slippery dust. My black swan withers in the brush. Now, the character is black, African American, and then he says to her, cowl, pretty bird, like a bird cow, mm-hmm. Pretty bird, cowl, pretty bird. Then when I'm in you, the glaze off your shoulder will ivory. Okay? So then if you have that actress on stage delivering those lines, it's very concrete, and everybody can understand it.
These are very heavy
yes,
lines and subjects. Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned the Lost in the Grand Canyon. Did you write that?
I've written a film script on that and sent it to Hollywood and all that, and to an agent I had. And he said, now make your character 40 years old and all this stuff. Now, a lot of times when they want to get rid of you, if they don't think that the script is marketable, they'll give you a lot of things to do. And I always say, you know, where's the money? And if you do that, I'll attempt to write it your way. But I knew I was 65 at the time, and that was part of the adventure. It was survival time. And I was lost there stranded for 6 days and in 130-degree temperature.
How did you happen to be in the Grand Canyon at that time?
Well, a jogging friend of mine, she was a marathon runner, and I was at the time too. I asked her, now, I love nature, where's a beautiful place to go and all that? She says, Grand Canyon, go there. And so I set off at 9 o'clock in the morning one day, and at 4:30 I collapsed on on a switchback trail.
And you have to have a plan when you're in the Grand
Right,
Canyon.
right, I did. Well, I knew where to go. The fellow at the top told me not to go, and I said, well, I'll be up in a couple hours, and I was fibbing him. I thought I'd meet somebody down, you know, but I never saw anybody for 5 days, 6 days. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I collapsed on the switchback trail and put my back against a scrub bush tree that was maybe 5 feet tall, and put my head between my legs, and I started to shake, and I thought, well, I'm going to die, but at least I'll be cool. I was, you know, I was going through shock, and then I thought, oh my God, I have 8 days and my daughter's getting married. This is terrible. So I got to my feet, and I started to walk down the switchback trail, and I saw this ancient Indian woman sitting in the center of the path, and I could see the gnarled face, her wrinkles of her face and everything else, and I knew something was wrong. So I got about 15 feet from her, and the image dissipated. And then after that, I sort of walked through whatever it was, and I hit water, and then I, you know, 7 hours later, I got to the bottom of the canyon. Mm-hmm. And then for the rest of the time, I was trying to survive in the crevices of rocks. But anyway, I wrote a film script on that. In fact, there's a fellow here in Chicago that wants to put it into a play, wants me to write a play on it. But I think, you know, I'd like to have the background of the canyon and everything else. So I'm still trying to find somebody that's interested in that script.
And you made a reference of the reader and the writer.
Yes.
What is that about?
Well, in 1967, it's funny how this started. I was in a library like this, and I worked as a speechwriter for politicians and also as an administrative assistant. So I would sneak up during my break hour and start writing. And I was in the library, and the darndest thing happened. I'm sitting next to a pretty girl, and I'm a terrible speller. I'm sort of dyslexic. And I was about to ask her, how do you spell abreast, like keeping abreast with the time? And I thought, that's the dumbest thing to ask. And that started a play of this madman in the library, and it took off from there, where this guy wants to control everything in the library. He's the director, the actor. He wants to be everything. He's the playwright. And eventually they throw him out of the library. Anyway, a producer saw the play and said, how would you like this to be done by WTTW? We have a Rockefeller grant, and we'll do the play. So this was about 1967, 68, and they did it, and then it was circulated through, at that time it was the predecessor to PBS. Mm-hmm. It was called NET Television, so it was done for 3 or 4 years in Canada and in the United States, all through the country here. So
have you done any really light plays, any light work? You mentioned comedy.
Well, that was a comedy.
That was a comedy.
Where he gets kicked out of the library by the librarian and some young lady. But anyway, yes, but they're always with a dark side to them, dark humor. And, you know, I laugh at the...
And you just mentioned speech writing, so do you do that on the side, or is that
I did at the time. I did at the time. I did a little bit of speech writing for various politicians in the Chicago area.
How do you market that? Do you?
Well, no, they knew about me because of my plays. You know, some of them had come to my plays, or one thing or another, and you know, so the word got out, and I did some speech writing. But then I got into fundraising and would write proposals, but I always stayed with my hand in a lot of writing, commercial writing too.
Mm-hmm. Your early diagnosis as a dyslexic, how did that influence your development in the literary field?
Well, it's an odd thing. I think sometimes that a defect can actually help you out if you can can rise above it. I hadn't read through a novel since I was in sophomore year college. I just had a difficulty in reading. But I saw the peculiarities of a sentence. Now this has all helped me because I realized that we take a regular sentence structure in a normal way. And what has helped me in both my poetry and in my playwriting is to notice that in normal dialogue or even in poetic writing, there's a lot of reversals going on and everything else that a dyslexic does naturally. So it was something that I was attuned to because of my problem.
I see. That brings up another question. Did you type all of your creations, or did you dictate it to a tape recorder and somebody else typed it?
I didn't learn how to type until about 7 years ago. And that's because of the new kind of typewriters and all that. I usually had people do the typewriting for me, either my wonderful wife or an actress or one person or another. I do it all in longhand. And I thought that that kept me in touch with my writing, but now I'm used to typing and doing it.
You use a computer now?
Yes, I use a computer now. Now I can type with 2 fingers.
Isn't technology wonderful?
Yes, it is. It really is.
Yeah. Let's get back to your undergraduate. Did you have any specific courses in writing, either maybe even in high school?
Never. I was sort of a natural writer, though. I was a punchy kid. I didn't read much or anything, and everything was sports. But I used to write these skits, and the Jesuit priest would tack them up on the bulletin board, and they'd read it, and I'd be always mocking the prefects, like I'd be a sleepwalker and strangle them or something like that.
Heavy again.
These crazy things. They're just crazy kid stuff. But I wasn't, these are fun things, but I never thought of being a writer. Yeah. I thought of myself as an athlete. But then I flunked out of Notre Dame. I went to Notre Dame and thought I'd be an athlete, and fellows that were 40 pounds heavier than I could run faster. So.
In football, was this?
Yeah. And so I realized competition was a little too keen for me.
Are you currently working on anything?
Oh yes, I'm always working on things. I work on, between my plays I write poems, so I'm always knocking off a
Is there anything that we would likely be familiar with right now?
At the present time, I'm trying to get a play done of a friend of mine. Might be an interesting story here because in 1973, a fellow read about me in the newspaper, and he started sending me his scripts. He was in prison for killing his girlfriend. He had stabbed her 28 times, and he was a lifer. Well, anyway, he got out in 1985, and he phoned me every day since then up till about 6 months ago. And this fellow, before he died, he was a paranoid schizophrenic and heard the voices and everything else. But before he died, he had lost everything. Health, he had trauma because of drugs, medical treatment. He lived like a city hermit in an attic. But the one thing he did have was Jesus. And I remember just before he died, he said, I want to see Jesus. And I thought, oh, this is a tip-off. He wants to commit suicide, because he used to talk about suicide. I said, David, Jesus, you take your time and all that stuff. And he said, no, he used to call me, because I get mad at him, he'd call me Daffy Duck. Okay, so you know how Daffy Duck goes on. Well, he said to me, listen, Daffy Duck, I just want to see Jesus. And he had such a strong faith. Anyway, I wrote about that.
What was your initial contact with him?
He knew about me through the newspaper. This story that was written about my life.
That was after his incarceration.
In his incarceration, 1973, there was in the Chicago magazine, Tribune magazine, there was an article called Playwright Anonymous, and they equated me with an alcoholic, that I was addicted to writing plays. And it was sort of a play kind of a thing. But anyway, he read about that, and I saw this raw talent. He was a diamond in the rough. So I ended up, he sent me a script. I got 2 of his scripts done in Chicago, his plays. In fact...
Under his name?
Under his name, sure. And the funny thing about it, when he got out in 1985, Studs Terkel had him on the air, or not on the air, but talked about him. Irv Kupcinet, these were old, people in Chicago, established people in Chicago. Anyway, I was walking down the street with him, and he was telling me about how he knew Studs Terkel and all that, and I sort of half believed him, because he used to exaggerate. All of a sudden, across the street is Studs Terkel, and he runs across the street and he says, "Studs," and he embraces the guy. And Studs, his arms are flapping like a wounded bird. And he said, "Oh my goodness," but he did hug him, and it was a wonderful thing. But that's how this fellow was. This David Andrews was just completely uninhibited, but very honest. I'll give you an example. He'd call me, and he'd be irritated with me because I wouldn't return his call in time, or one thing or another. So he'd say things like, and he noticed my voice was harsh, and he'd say, "You had a fight with your wife." I said, "David, that's none of your business." And by the way, she wouldn't let him into the house because we had 7 kids, and she was worried, he had killed somebody, all that stuff, and he might fixate on her.
Yes.
So he'd say something like, "I'm going to come and get Noel, and we're going to elope. We're going to have a 2-month honeymoon, and then we're going to come back and adopt you." So he'd talk like that. Well, anyway, here's the beautiful thing about it. 2 weeks before he died, he was a flatliner, comatose state. And my wife grabbed his hand and said, "David, I'm here. Let's go. One thing, though, we're not going to take Bill." Not take it as a joke. And darned if that oscilloscope didn't jump. Now, my wife says it didn't, but the nurse came in and thought I had kicked the wiring or something. But anyway, it's a beautiful story, I think.
Well, it's an interesting anecdote, and thank you for being here, and thank you for contributing all of your information about your plays and yourself, and we're happy that you came.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Off the Shelf, Conversations with Authors. I'm Martha Kofod.